We deployed our strongest, our most disciplined, our most feared. The Obsidian Phalanx. They had never failed. Not once. Entire civilizations had collapsed at the mere announcement of their arrival. Entire fleets had surrendered before the first shot was fired, because when the Phalanx descended, war didn't begin. It ended. And this time, their target was humanity, a fractured species, unrefined, emotion-driven, predictable, weak. That's what we believed. That's what the Dominion Command believed. That's what everyone believed. Until the signals stopped. It began like every other operation. Clean, precise, controlled. Dropships pierced the upper atmosphere in perfect formation. Black holes slicing through storm clouds like blades through fabric. No resistance. No interception. No threat. Below them, a barren world. Dry. Cracked. Lifeless. A place not worth defending, which made it perfect, because humans had chosen to make their stand there. Not in orbit, not behind shields, but on a dead planet with nothing to offer. We thought it was desperation. We thought it was stupidity. We were wrong. The Phalanx deployed flawlessly. Heavy units first, then command corps, then ground suppression teams. Every movement synchronized. Every position calculated. Every possibility accounted for. Standard protocol. Maximum efficiency. They spread across the terrain, scanning, mapping, preparing to erase what little resistance remained. Human forces were minimal, scattered, primitive, barely organized, exactly as predicted. And then, the first anomaly occurred. A signal flicker. Brief. Almost nothing. Command flagged it as interference. Environmental. Insignificant. They continued, advancing deeper, establishing control, executing the operation exactly as designed. Then the ground shifted. Not violently, not suddenly, just enough to register. A minor instability. Again, dismissed. Again, ignored. Because the Phalanx did not hesitate, did not question, did not doubt. That was their strength. That was their flaw. Seconds later, another signal broke. This time, longer, distorted, incomplete. A unit requesting recalibration. Then silence. Command attempted to reconnect. No response. Unusual, but not alarming. Units sometimes failed. Terrain sometimes interfered. Everything was still under control, or so they believed. Then came the first collapse. A section of ground gave way beneath an advancing column, not a full breach, not a catastrophic failure, but enough. Enough to disrupt formation, enough to create delay, enough to matter. And still, they advanced, because that's what they were built to do. No fear, no hesitation, no deviation, only forward, always forward. And somewhere, watching all of this unfold, was a single human soldier, quiet, unnoticed, unimportant. At least, that's what everyone thought. The Phalanx continued deeper into the dead zone, into terrain they did not understand, into patterns they could not see, into a battlefield that was already moving against them. On B1, signals began to fail. Not all at once, not dramatically, just disappearing. A unit here, another there. Gaps, forming in what had once been perfect formation. Command recalculated, adjusted, compensated. But something was wrong, something they couldn't define, couldn't measure, couldn't predict. And then, the final transmission came through. Broken, fragmented, almost lost in static. Ground, unstable. Pattern, artificial. Recall. It cut off. Completely. No follow-up. No recovery. No survivors. Just silence. Total. Unbroken. Silence. The Obsidian Phalanx, the most powerful force we had ever created, had vanished. Not defeated. Not repelled. Not destroyed in battle. Erased. Without explanation. without resistance, without even a final stand. And on that dead world, where nothing should have survived, where no strategy should have worked, there was only one thing left. One signal, one life, one human. And that was when we realized this was never their battlefield. It was his. Long before the phalanx vanished, before the ground broke beneath them, before the silence, there was a man no one listened to. Sergent Ilias Rann. If you had asked anyone in the outpost about him, you would have heard the same things. He hesitates. He overthinks. Not made for frontline combat. Some said he was cautious. Others said he was afraid. Most simply ignored him, because in a war defined by speed and aggression, thinking was seen as weakness. And Ilias Rann thought too much. The outpost itself wasn't much. A scattered cluster of reinforced structures clinging to the edge of a broken world, surrounded by dry plains and fractured terrain that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. No cities, no infrastructure, no strategic value. At least, that's what Command believed, which is why they sent soldiers like Rann there. The overlooked, the inconvenient, the ones who didn't fit the standard mold. Rann, you planning to fight today? Or just stare at rocks again? The laughter came easily, too easily. A group of soldiers stood nearby, checking weapons, running diagnostics, preparing for a fight they knew they couldn't win. Rann didn't respond immediately. He was crouched near the edge of a shallow ridge, running his fingers lightly across the ground, feeling it. Not just the surface, but the tension beneath it. Another soldier shook his head. See, told you, he's not even listening. More laughter. Rann finally stood, calm, unbothered. His gaze moved past them, out toward the distance, where the land wasn't flat. It was wrong, subtly uneven, layered in ways that didn't feel natural. You ever notice this place doesn't settle? He said quietly. The nearest soldier frowned. What? The ground, Rann continued. It shifts, even when nothing's moving. Another voice cut in. It's a dead planet, Rann. Everything here's broken. That's not what I mean. But they weren't interested. They had bigger concerns, like survival, like the incoming threat everyone already knew about. The Carthix Dominion didn't send warnings. They didn't negotiate. They didn't hesitate. And when word came that the Obsidian Phalanx had been deployed, the mood in the outpost changed instantly. Not to fear, but to resignation. Phalanx is coming, someone said over comms. Confirmed. No panic followed. No scrambling. Just quiet acceptance. Because everyone knew what that meant. End of the line. Guess this is it, one soldier muttered. Yeah, another replied. At least it'll be quick. Rann said nothing. He was still looking outward, still watching the terrain, still thinking, because something didn't add up. This planet, this dead zone, wasn't stable, it wasn't predictable, and it definitely wasn't empty. Command says, hold position, the squad leader announced. Delay them if we can. A pause. Then, no reinforcements coming. No one reacted. Because that part was expected. They weren't here to win. They were here to slow the enemy down. Buy time, even if that time was measured in seconds. The squad dispersed, preparing weapons, checking ammunition, running final diagnostics. Everything by the book, everything standard, everything predictable. Rann moved differently. He didn't check his weapon first, didn't reinforce his position, didn't even look toward the sky where the enemy would soon appear. Instead, he walked out past the perimeter, ignoring the warnings behind him. Rann, where are you going? No answer. Just movement. Steady, purposeful. He stopped near a fractured section of ground, where the surface dipped slightly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. He crouched again, pressed his hand into the dust, closed his eyes, and listened, not with his ears, but with instinct, with experience, with something deeper. There it was again. That subtle shift, that tension, like the planet itself was holding its breath. You feel it too, don't you? He murmured. No one heard him. No one cared. Back at the outpost, The soldiers continued preparing for a battle they believed was already lost. But Rain wasn't thinking about fighting. He was thinking about something else entirely. Not how to survive the phalanx, but how to stop them. Because for the first time, he wasn't looking at the enemy. He was looking at the battlefield and seeing something no one else could. "This place isn't broken," he whispered. Pause. Then, it's waiting. Far above, the first signs of atmospheric disturbance began to form. Clouds shifting unnaturally. Light bending. The arrival had begun. And still, no one paid attention to the man standing alone in the dust. The man who had been dismissed, mocked, overlooked. Because sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in a war isn't the strongest soldier. It's the one no one thinks matters. And by the time they realize it, it's already too late. The order came without ceremony. No urgency. No attempt to inspire. Just a simple transmission delivered like a final note in a report already closed. Outpost K-47. Hold position. A pause. Delay enemy advance for as long as possible. Another pause. Longer this time. As if even command understood what came next. No reinforcements available. That was it. No strategy. No fallback plan. No extraction. Just hold. Everyone in the outpost understood the translation. You are already lost. The message echoed through the base and settled like dust over everything. No one argued. No one questioned it. Because there was nothing to question. The Obsidian Phalanx didn't lose battles. They didn't get delayed. They didn't get stopped. They erased. And Outpost K-47 was next. "They're not even pretending this time," one soldier muttered. Another gave a dry laugh. "Why bother? We all know how this ends." Weapons were checked again, not out of hope, but out of habit. Armor sealed, systems calibrated, final routines carried out like rituals. Not for survival, but for dignity. The squad leader gathered everyone near the central structure, his voice steady, but quieter than usual. "You all heard the order. A pause. We hold as long as we can." He looked at each of them. Onebi 1. No speeches. No false promises. Just truth. Make it count. Heads nodded. Not with confidence, but with acceptance. Because this wasn't about winning anymore. It was about how they faced the end. And still, there was one soldier not standing with them. Arain. He was back at the edge of the perimeter, looking out at the same broken terrain, still studying it, still searching. The squad leader approached him slowly. "You heard the order," he said. Rain didn't turn. "Yeah. Then why aren't you preparing?" That question lingered in the air. Heavy. Impatient. Rain finally spoke. "Because preparing for a fight we can't win doesn't change the outcome." The squad leader frowned. "So what? You're just going to stand here and watch?" Rain shook his head slightly. "No. A pause. I'm trying to understand why we think we can't win." That earned a short, bitter laugh. "Because the phalanx is coming," the leader said. "That's why." Rain turned now, calm, focused, and they've never fought here. The leader's expression hardened. "This isn't the time for theories. This isn't a theory." Rain gestured toward the ground. "It's the only advantage we have." "Terrain won't stop them," the leader snapped. "They'll walk right through it. Not if it doesn't hold." Silence. For a moment, just a moment, there was doubt. Then it passed. Because belief is hard to change, especially when fear has already taken its place. "You're overthinking again," the leader said. "We fight. We delay. We die. That's the mission." Rain didn't argue, didn't push, because he knew something the others didn't. "Not yet. They're not invincible," he said quietly. The leader sighed. "Rane. They're predictable." That word hung in the air. Predictable. It didn't belong. Not when talking about the most elite force in the galaxy. Not when talking about something that had never failed. "You really believe that?" the leader asked. Ray nodded once. "They rely on control, structure, perfect movement, a pause. And this place, doesn't allow that. The leader looked out across the terrain, saw nothing but broken ground and empty space. Even if you're right, he said, we don't have the firepower to exploit it. Rain's eyes didn't leave the horizon. We don't need firepower. Another pause. Then what do we need? Rain answered without hesitation. Timing. Far above them, the sky began to tear. Clouds, twisting violently as dark shapes emerged through the atmosphere. Dropships, massive, silent, descending with terrifying precision. The phalanx had arrived. Every soldier at the outpost turned their gaze upward. For a moment, even breathing felt heavier, because this was it. The beginning of the end. Engines roared as the ship stabilized overhead. Then, on HFY, they began to deploy. Black armored units descending in perfect formation, landing with synchronized impact across the plains. No chaos, no hesitation, just order. Perfect. Unbreakable order. They're here, someone whispered. The squad leader stepped back. Activated comms. All units prepare for engagement. Weapons were raised. Positions taken. Final moments ticking away. And still, Rain didn't move like the others. He didn't aim, didn't brace, didn't prepare to fire. Instead, he looked at the ground one last time. At the fractures, the layers, the subtle shifts no one else noticed. Then he spoke, not loudly, not urgently, but with certainty. Don't engage them directly. The squad leader turned sharply. What? They want us to fight head on, Rain said. That's how they win. Then what do you suggest? The leader demanded. Rain's gaze lifted. Not to the enemy, but to the terrain between them. We let the planet fight. The first wave of the obsidian phalanx began to advance. Step by step, perfectly aligned, unstoppable. And for the first time, as I watched them move, I realized something. They weren't cautious. They weren't adapting. They weren't even considering the possibility of failure. Because to them, failure didn't exist. And that was the beginning of their end. The first footsteps of the obsidian phalanx echoed across the dead world. Heavy, measured, perfectly synchronized. Each step carried weight, not just of armor and machinery, but of certainty. They did not slow down. They did not scan for weakness in the ground beneath them, because they didn't need to. Or at least, they believed they didn't. From the ridge, we watched them advance. Rows of black-armored figures moving like a single organism. Each unit connected. Each movement calculated. Each decision already made before it happened. They're not even scouting, someone muttered. They don't have to, another replied. They've already won. That belief spread quickly, like a quiet infection, because everything about the phalanx reinforced it. Their presence alone felt like the end. But Rain wasn't watching them. Not directly. He was watching something else. The ground between them. The subtle depressions forming beneath each step. The faint tremors spreading outward in barely visible patterns. The way dust shifted, not randomly, but in response. There, he whispered. I moved closer. What are you seeing? Rain pointed toward a section of terrain just ahead of the advancing formation. At first, it looked like nothing, just another stretch of fractured ground. But then, I noticed it. A slight dip, a ripple, almost like the surface was breathing. It's layered, Rain said. Not solid, not stable. Stacked pressure zones. He crouched again, pressing his hand into the dust. They're walking over fault lines. I frowned. Even if that's true, it won't be enough to stop them. Rain nodded. Not on its own. A pause. Then, but it doesn't have to. That was the moment everything shifted. Not on the battlefield, but in understanding. They don't need to fall, Rain continued. They just need to lose balance. I looked back at the advancing phalanx. Their formation was flawless. Too flawless. Tight spacing. Perfect alignment. Every unit dependent on the position of the others. If one section destabilizes, I said slowly, it affects everything? Rain nodded once. They rely on uniform ground. Another pause. And this planet doesn't give them that. The idea was simple. Deceptively simple. But executing it, that was something else entirely. "We don't have enough explosives to collapse the terrain," I said. Rain stood. Calm. Focused. "We don't need to collapse it. A beat. We just need to weaken the right points. At the right time." I looked at him. Really looked this time. And for the first time, I didn't see hesitation. I didn't see uncertainty. I saw precision. A mind already several steps ahead. "You've been studying this place," I said, "since we got here." Rain didn't deny it. "Something felt off," he replied. So I started mapping it. He activated a small holographic projector. A crude display flickered to life between us. Not clean, not perfect, but detailed. Lines, cracks, hidden fault paths, running beneath the surface. The entire battlefield, revealed in a way no one else had seen. "This isn't a battlefield," Rain said quietly. "It's a structure, a pose. And structures can fail." I felt it then. That shift, that moment where something impossible starts to make sense. "You're not trying to stop them," I said. Rain shook his head. "I'm trying to guide them." Another pause. "Make them step exactly where we need them to." Below us, the phalanx continued their advance. Closer now. Faster. Confident. Unchallenged. Exactly as expected. "They think we're going to meet them head on," Rain said. "Or retreat." He looked at me. "But we're going to do neither." The plan was forming now. Not fully spoken, but understood. They walk into unstable ground. We trigger minor collapses. They adjust formation and move exactly where we want them. Rain nodded. "Every reaction they make, we control." The weight of it settled in. This wasn't defense. This wasn't survival. This was manipulation. Turning the enemy's strength into their weakness. "They've never had to adapt like this," I said. Rain's voice was quiet. "They won't even realize they're adapting until it's too late." The first units of the phalanx reached the outer edge of the unstable zone. Sensors scanned. Readings returned. Everything normal. Because the instability wasn't obvious. It was subtle, hidden, waiting. "They trust their systems," Rain said. "But their systems don't understand this planet." Another pause. "So we make them rely on it anyway." He turned toward the outpost, toward the soldiers still preparing for a direct fight they no longer needed to take. "It's not about strength," he said. "It's about control." The ground trembled again. Slightly stronger this time. The phalanx didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't question. And that was the final confirmation. Rain looked back at the advancing force, then at the terrain, then at the crude map flickering between us. Everything aligned, everything ready. "Now we prepare," he said. And just like that, the most powerful army ever deployed stopped being the hunters and became the ones being led. War isn't always decided in the moment of impact. Sometimes it's decided long before the first shot is fired. In quiet movements, in unseen adjustments, in decisions no one else even notices. That was where we were now. Not fighting, not retreating, but preparing. And for the first time since the phalanx arrived, there was something different in the air. Not hope, not yet, but direction. Rain moved quickly through the outpost, not with urgency, but with precision. Every step intentional, every command measured. "Shift your charges here," he said, pointing to a section of fractured ground just beyond the ridge. "Not deep, shallow placement. We want instability, not collapse." The soldier hesitated. "That won't stop them." Rain didn't look up. "I'm not trying to stop them. A pause. I'm trying to move them." That answer spread quickly. Confusion at first. Then curiosity. Because for the first time, someone wasn't talking about delaying the enemy. They were talking about controlling them. "Sensor arrays go here and here." Rain continued, marking positions along narrow stretches of terrain. "Low frequency. Passive only. No active scans." "Why passive?" another soldier asked. "So they don't see us watching." The soldier blinked, then nodded. "Because..." That made sense. More sense than anything else they had heard so far. Across the outpost, the preparation began to change. Weapons were still checked, but now they weren't the focus. The terrain was. Small teams moved out under Rain's direction, not to fortify positions, but to weaken them. Charges placed along fault lines, but never enough to trigger a full collapse. Only enough to create stress. Only enough to shift balance. Only enough to matter. Remember, Rain said quietly to one group, if it looks obvious, it's wrong. They worked in silence because the enemy was already close. Too close. Every movement carried risk. Every step outside the perimeter could be the last. But still, they followed because something had changed. Rain wasn't guessing. He was certain. And certainty, in a moment like this, was enough. I watched as the first layer of the plan took shape. Weak points marked. Trigger zones aligned. Movement paths predicted. It wasn't a defense. It was a system. A chain of events waiting to be activated. They'll adjust after the first disruption, I said. Rain nodded. Exactly. And then we adjust with them. That was the difference. This wasn't a single trap. It was a sequence. A conversation between action and reaction. Every move the phalanx made would be answered, guided, controlled. They think in patterns, Rain continued, so we give them patterns. He pointed to the holographic map again, to a narrow stretch between two unstable ridges. They'll avoid collapse zones, he said. Move towards stable ground. I followed his gesture. That path, it's not stable, Rain replied. It just looks like it is. A pause. And by the time they realize that, they'll already be committed. The scale of it became clear then. This wasn't just about survival. This was about engineering a battlefield in real time, using nothing but limited resources and a deep understanding of how the enemy thought. Above us, the sky darkened as more phalanx units deployed. Reinforcements, heavy units, command corps descending into position. The full force was arriving. They're accelerating deployment, someone reported. They're not expecting resistance, another added. Rain didn't react. Good. That single word carried weight, because overconfidence was exactly what he needed. Final checks, he ordered. Once they enter the first zone, there's no resetting this. The teams moved faster now. Last adjustments, final placements, every charge calibrated, every sensor aligned, every escape route planned. Not for retreat, but for repositioning. Because they weren't going to stand and fight. They were going to move, constantly, always one step ahead. I walked beside Rain as he made his final rounds. You're asking them to trust something they can't see, I said. He nodded. I know. And if you're wrong? He stopped, just for a moment, then looked out across the terrain, at the approaching phalanx, at the battlefield he had reshaped in silence. Then we were already dead anyway. There was no fear in his voice, no hesitation, just truth. And somehow, that made it easier to believe him. The first units of the phalanx reached the outer markers. Sensors flickered. Readings updated. They're entering the zone, a voice said over comms. Every soldier froze, not in fear, but in anticipation. Because now, there was nothing left to prepare, nothing left to adjust, only execution. Rain stepped back toward the ridge, eyes fixed on the battlefield, watching every movement, every step, every shift in formation. They'll trigger it themselves, he said quietly. No need to rush. The ground trembled faintly beneath us. A warning, or a promise. The phalanx advanced, unaware, unstoppable, exactly where we wanted them. And for the first time, as I watched them move into the trap, I didn't see an invincible army. I saw something else, something far more fragile, something already beginning to break. They didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. The Obsidian phalanx never rushed. They advanced with certainty, with control, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been challenged. Every step landed with precision. Heavy, deliberate, synchronized. The ground beneath them shifted slightly with each impact, but they didn't notice. Or if they did, they didn't care. From the ridge, we watched in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Even breathing felt like it might give us away. "They've entered the outer zone," a voice whispered over comms. Rain didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the battlefield, tracking everything: formation spacing, unit alignment, weight distribution. Every detail mattered. Because the plan wasn't just about where they stepped, it was about how they moved. "They're tighter than expected," I said quietly. Rain gave a small nod. "Good." That answer still felt strange. Everything about this situation should have been bad. The strongest enemy force in existence, advancing directly toward us. And yet, he wanted them closer, more compact, more predictable. "They trust their formation," he said. "They think it makes them stronger." Below us, the phalanx continued forward, rows upon rows of black-armored units moving as one. No gaps, no hesitation, no variation. Perfect. And that perfection was exactly what Rain needed. "They're about to cross the first fault line," someone reported. A pause. All eyes shifted. Waiting. Nothing happened. The units passed over it without slowing, without reacting. "They didn't trigger it," another voice said. Doubt crept in. Small, but noticeable. I glanced at Rain. He didn't move. Didn't react. "Not yet," he said quietly. "They need more weight." The next wave of units moved in behind the first, stacking pressure, increasing load. The ground responded, subtle at first. A faint ripple beneath the surface, barely visible, unless you knew where to look. Rain saw it. I saw it. Most didn't. "There," he murmured. The ripple spread, slowly, like a crack forming beneath glass. Still, the phalanx advanced, unaware, unchanged. "They're not scanning deep enough," Rain said. "They don't expect instability at this level." That was the difference. Their systems were built for known variables, predictable environments, controlled conditions. This was none of those things. "They're crossing the threshold," a soldier whispered. Rain's hand moved slightly, hovering near the trigger, but he didn't activate anything. "Not yet." "They have to commit," he said. Another step, then another. More units entering the zone. More weight pressing down on fragile layers beneath the surface. The tension was unbearable now. Every second stretched thin. Every movement amplified. Because we all knew something was about to happen. "They're still not reacting," I said. Rain's voice remained calm. "They will." Below us, one of the lead units paused, just for a fraction of a second. A tiny adjustment, a recalibration. Then it continued. But that moment, that hesitation, it mattered. "They felt it," I said. Rain nodded. "But they don't understand it." That was the key. Feeling something wrong, but not knowing what it was, not knowing how to respond. The formation tightened slightly. Units adjusting position, compensating, trying to maintain stability, exactly as expected. "They're reinforcing the pressure point," Rain said, "and making it worse." The ground trembled again, stronger this time. A low, almost inaudible vibration spreading outward. Some of the soldiers behind me shifted uneasily, because now they could feel it too. The planet wasn't still. It was reacting. "They're entering the primary zone," came the next report. This was it. The point of no return. Once they crossed this line, there would be no going back. Rain's gaze hardened, focused, but it's easy. "Hold," he said. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to stop. The phalanx advanced, step by step, deeper into the unstable ground, closer to the center of the trap. "They're fully committed," I whispered. Rain waited one more second. Just one. Then, now, his hand dropped. The first trigger activated. Not a massive explosion. Not a dramatic blast. Just a sharp, Controlled detonation beneath the surface. A small section of ground shifted violently, enough to break alignment, enough to disrupt balance. The lead units stumbled, not falling, but adjusting, recalibrating, reacting. "They're stabilizing," someone said. "Of course they are," Rain replied. "That's what we want. Because this wasn't the strike. This wasn't the attack. This was the beginning. The first move in a sequence, already in motion. Below us, the phalanx tightened formation again. Units compensating, redistributing weight, trying to regain perfect alignment. But the ground beneath them was no longer cooperating. Small cracks began to form. Invisible at first, then spreading, quiet, relentless. "They're adapting," I said. Rain nodded. "And walking exactly where we need them." The second tremor hit. Stronger. Vita, more noticeable. This time, several units lost footing. Not completely, but enough to create disorder. Not chaos, but the beginning of it. "They're slowing down," a soldier whispered. "Good," Rain said again, because slower movement meant more time, more pressure, more instability. Everything stacking, everything building. The phalanx didn't retreat, didn't stop, didn't question, because they couldn't, because they had never needed to. And that was why this was working. "They still think they're in control," I said. Rain's voice was almost a whisper now. "They never lost it before." Below us, the formation continued forward, but it wasn't perfect anymore. Tiny gaps forming, minor delays, subtle misalignments. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, but enough. Enough for the next phase. The ground shifted again. This time, no one missed it. And for the first time, the obsidian phalanx hesitated. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Because in war, a single moment of uncertainty is all it takes. The ground didn't warn them again. It didn't tremble. It didn't ripple. It gave way. A violent fracture tore through the center of the formation, splitting the earth open with a deafening roar. Entire sections of the battlefield collapsed inward, swallowing rows of obsidian phalanx units before they could react. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was worse. A deep, grinding, planetary scream. "They're breaking," someone shouted. But Rain didn't celebrate. "Phase 2, he said calmly. And then everything escalated. Secondary charges ignited beneath the surface, not all at once, but in sequence. A chain réaction, each detonation destabilizing the next section of terrain, forcing the enemy forward, forcing them inward, forcing them exactly where Rain wanted them. The phalanx tried to respond. Units shifted formation, rebalancing, reinforcing weak points. But every adjustment made things worse. Because the ground beneath them was no longer stable. It was alive. It was collapsing in patterns they couldn't predict. "They're adapting," a soldier yelled. "No," I said, watching closely. "They're reacting." And there was a difference. A critical one. Above the chaos, dropships roared into the sky. Phalanx reinforcements deploying rapidly. Heavy units descending. Command corps activating mid-air. They were escalating, trying to overwhelm the disruption with sheer force. "They're bringing in aerial support," someone warned. Rain nodded. "Let them." That answer sent a chill through me, because it meant this wasn't even the full trap yet. As the first aerial units descended, Rain gave the next command. "Trigger the ridge." For a split second, nothing happened. Then, the mountainside exploded. Not outward, but downward. A controlled collapse. Thousands of tons of fractured rock cascading into the battlefield below, cutting off escape routes, crushing entire formations, and forcing the remaining units into an even tighter kill zone. Dust filled the air instantly. Thick, blinding, the battlefield vanished into a storm of debris and shadow. "Visibility 0, someone shouted. "Perfect," Rain replied, because the phalanx relied on precision targeting, clear lines, clean data. And now, They had none of it. Through the dust, shapes moved. Massive, indistinct, confused. The phalanx was still advancing, still trying to maintain control. But their perfect formation was gone. They're disorganized, I said. The planet wasn't still. It was reacting. They're entering the primary zone, came the next report. This was it. The point of no return. Once they crossed this line, there would be no going back. Rain's gaze hardened, focused, preciso. Hold, he said. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to stop. The phalanx advanced, step by step, deeper into the unstable ground, closer to the center of the trap. They're fully committed, I whispered. Rain waited one more second. Just one. Then, now, his hand dropped. The first trigger activated. Not a massive explosion. Not a dramatic blast. Just a sharp, controlled detonation beneath the surface. A small section of ground shifted violently. Enough to break alignment. Enough to disrupt balance. The lead units stumbled. Not falling, but adjusting, recalibrating, reacting. They're stabilizing, someone said. Of course they are, Rain replied. That's what we want. Because this wasn't the strike. This wasn't the attack. This was the beginning. The first move in a sequence, already in motion. Below us, the phalanx tightened formation again. Units compensating, redistributing weight, trying to regain perfect alignment. But the ground beneath them was no longer cooperating. Small cracks began to form. Invisible at first, then spreading, quiet, relentless. They're adapting, I said. Rain nodded. And walking exactly where we need them. The second tremor hit. Stronger. Vida, more noticeable. This time, several units lost footing. Not completely, but enough to create disorder. Not chaos, but the beginning of it. They're slowing down, a soldier whispered. Good, Rain said again, because slower movement meant more time, more pressure, more instability. Everything stacking, everything building. The phalanx didn't retreat, didn't stop, didn't question, because they couldn't, because they had never needed to. And that was why this was working. They still think they're in control, I said. Rain's voice was almost a whisper now. They never lost it before. Below us, the formation continued forward, but it wasn't perfect anymore. Tiny gaps forming, minor delays, subtle misalignments. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, but enough. Enough for the next phase. The ground shifted again. This time, no one missed it. And for the first time, the obsidian phalanx hesitated. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Because in war, a single moment of uncertainty is all it takes. The ground didn't warn them again. It didn't tremble. It didn't ripple. It gave way. A violent fracture tore through the center of the formation, splitting the earth open with a deafening roar. Entire sections of the battlefield collapsed inward, swallowing rows of obsidian phalanx units before they could react. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was worse. A deep, grinding, planetary scream. They're breaking, someone shouted. But Rain didn't celebrate. Phase 2, he said calmly. And then everything escalated. Secondary charges ignited beneath the surface, not all at once, but in sequence. A chain réaction, each detonation destabilizing the next section of terrain, forcing the enemy forward, forcing them inward, forcing them exactly where Rain wanted them. The phalanx tried to respond. Units shifted formation, rebalancing, reinforcing weak points. But every adjustment made things worse. Because the ground beneath them was no longer stable. It was alive. It was collapsing in patterns they couldn't predict. They're adapting, a soldier yelled. No, I said, watching closely. They're reacting. And there was a difference. A critical one. Above the chaos, dropships roared into the sky. Phalanx reinforcements deploying rapidly. Heavy units descending. Command cores activating mid-air. They were escalating, trying to overwhelm the disruption with sheer force. "They're bringing in aerial support," someone warned. Rain nodded. "Let them." That answer sent a chill through me, because it meant this wasn't even the full trap yet. As the first aerial units descended, Rain gave the next command. "Trigger the ridge." For a split second, nothing happened. Then, the mountainside exploded. Not outward, but downward. A controlled collapse. Thousands of tons of fractured rock cascading into the battlefield below, cutting off escape routes, crushing entire formations, and forcing the remaining units into an even tighter kill zone. Dust filled the air instantly. Thick, blinding, the battlefield vanished into a storm of debris and shadow. "Visibility 0, someone shouted. "Perfect," Rain replied, because the Phalanx relied on precision targeting, clear lines, clean data. And now, they had none of it. Through the dust, shapes moved. Massive, undistinct, confused. The Phalanx was still advancing, still trying to maintain control. But their perfect formation was gone. "They're disorganized," I said. Rain's eyes didn't leave the battlefield. "Now we hit them." The first human strike team moved. Fast, silent, disappearing into the dust storm. No heavy armor, no large weapons, just speed and intent. "They're going in," someone said, stunned. "They're going through them," I replied, because this was the part no one expected. Not even me. The Phalanx was built to dominate open battle, to crush opposition through overwhelming force. But this wasn't open. This wasn't clear. This was chaos, close quarters, unpredictable terrain. And in that environment, humans were something else entirely. Explosions flashed within the dust. Short bursts, precise strikes, not random, targeted. They're hitting joints, sensor nodes, control links, I realized. Rain nodded once. "Break the system. The body follows." A Phalanx unit emerged briefly from the dust, only to collapse. Moments later, its structure compromised, its coordination gone. Another followed, then another, each one falling not to brute force, but to precision, to understanding, to strategy. "They can't see us," a soldier whispered. "They don't know where we are, and they don't know where they are either," I added. That was the real victory, not destruction, disorientation. The Phalanx tried to regroup, command signals pulsing through their network, but the terrain blocked transmission. The dust disrupted coordination. The collapsing ground shattered their alignment. They weren't one entity anymore. They were fragments, and fragments could be defeated. A massive shockwave tore through the battlefield. One of the command cores detonated mid-activation, its systems overloaded by unstable footing. "They're losing control," someone shouted. Rain finally stepped forward. Just one step, but it felt like a turning point. "Final sequence," he said. This was it. Everything converging. All phases aligning. The last set of charges activated. Deep beneath the surface. Stronger. More focused. The ground didn't just collapse this time. It shifted. Entire sections tilting inward, creating a basin of destruction. A trap with no exit. The remaining Phalanx units were pulled toward the center, sliding, falling, crashing into each other. For the first time, they weren't advancing. They were being moved, forced, controlled. "They're trapped," I whispered. Rain's voice was steady. "Now they understand." Another explosion ripped through the center, then another, and another, until the battlefield became a storm of fire, stone, and shattered metal. The Phalanx fought back. Of course they did. Energy blasts cut through the dust, striking blindly, destroying anything in their path. But it didn't matter, because they weren't aiming anymore. They were reacting. And reacting was losing. Onebi-1. The towering units fell, some crushed by the terrain, others dismantled by strike teams. Others simply failing, their systems unable to adapt to the chaos. The unstoppable force had been stopped, not by strength, not by numbers, but by something they had never accounted for. Human unpredictability, human creativity, human refusal to fight the way they were expected to. As the dust slowly began to settle, the battlefield revealed itself, and what remained was silence. The dust didn't settle all at once. It drifted slowly, like the battlefield itself was exhaling after the violence. Fragments of rock slid into place. Fires flickered in shallow craters, and beneath it all, the remains of the obsidian phalanx struggled to reorganize. But something fundamental had changed. They weren't moving as one anymore. No perfect synchronization, no flawless alignment, only scattered units, operating on broken commands. "They're trying to reconnect," a soldier said over comms. "Command signals are unstable." I watched as one of the larger units attempted to rise from the fractured ground. Its limbs adjusted, recalibrating balance, searching for coordination. For a moment, it almost looked like it would succeed. Then it froze. A delay, a miscalculation, and it collapsed again. "They've lost their network cohesion," I said. Rain nodded. That was always the objective. Not destruction, not annihilation, disconnection. Because the phalanx wasn't powerful as individuals. It was powerful as a system. And now, that system was failing. "They still have numbers," someone warned. "They can regroup." Rain didn't answer immediately. He was watching something, tracking patterns. "Even now, they're not regrouping," he said finally. "They're hesitating." That word mattered, because hesitation didn't exist in the phalanx. It wasn't part of their design. They didn't question. They didn't pause. They executed. Always. Until now, another unit attempted to advance. Slowly, carefully, testing the ground before each step. That alone was proof. "They're learning," I said. Rain shook his head slightly. "No, they're doubting." And doubt was far more dangerous. For them, because doubt created delay. Delay created vulnerability. And vulnerability was something they had never experienced before. "Strike teams. Hold positions," Rain ordered. No one moved. No one fired. And that felt wrong. Every instinct screamed to finish it, to push forward, to eliminate what remained. But Rain didn't allow it. "Why are we stopping?" someone asked. "Because they expect us to," he replied. That answer settled over the comms like a weight. Because it meant this wasn't over. "Not yet. This is where they decide," Rain continued. "Adapt or fail." I frowned. "They've been adapting this entire time." "Reacting," he corrected again. "Not the same thing." Below us, the surviving phalanx units shifted, slowly forming smaller clusters, trying to rebuild structure, trying to regain control. But every movement was cautious now, measured, uncertain. "They're afraid," a soldier whispered. No one corrected him, because for the first time, it felt true. Rain stepped forward onto the ridge, fully visible now. No cover, no concealment. I turned sharply. "What are you doing?" "They need to see us," he said. "That's the point." Below, several phalanx units turned toward him, sensors locking, targeting systems activating. For a moment, it looked like they would fire, but they didn't. They paused. "Again, they're waiting," I said quietly. Rain's voice was calm. "They're calculating, and they don't have enough data." That was it. That was the final break. An enemy built on certainty, facing something it couldn't predict, couldn't quantify, couldn't understand. And without understanding, there was no action. Only hesitation. Rain raised his hand slightly. Not in attack, not in threat, just visible, deliberate, controlled. "Advance," he said softly into comms. This time, the humans moved. Not rushing, not charging, walking, steady, confident, through the fractured battlefield, through the remains of what had once been an unstoppable force. They're not even fighting, someone said in disbelief. They don't need to, I replied, because this wasn't a battle anymore. It was a demonstration. The strike teams moved between the scattered phalanx units, disabling what little resistance remained. No chaos, no desperation, just precision, just control. One of the larger units attempted to fire. Its weapon charged, then stopped. Its systems stuttered, hesitated, failed. They're locking themselves out, I realized. Too many conflicting inputs. Rain nodded. They don't trust their own calculations anymore. And that was the true victory. Not the destroyed units. Not the shattered battlefield. But the collapse of confidence. The breakdown of certainty. The moment an invincible force stops believing in itself. On EB1, the remaining phalanx units powered down. Not destroyed. Not forced. They simply stopped, as if continuing no longer made sense. As if the outcome was already decided. The battlefield fell silent. Completely. No movement. No resistance. Only the wind moving through broken stone. I looked across the valley, at the remains of an army that had never known defeat. Until now, they deployed their strongest, I said quietly. Rain didn't look at me. They deployed what they understood. A pause, and we gave them something they didn't. I let that settle, because it explained everything. Not superior firepower, not overwhelming numbers, just something different, something unpredictable, something human. And in the end, that was enough. For a long time, no one moved. Not the soldiers, not the command staff, not even me, because we were all staring at the same thing, trying to understand it, trying to accept it. The battlefield was still. Where there should have been advancing formations, there were only broken lines. Where there should have been unstoppable motion, there was nothing. Just silence. They're gone, someone whispered. Not destroyed entirely, not erased, but ended. The obsidian phalanx had stopped. I slowly exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath without noticing. Across the valley, human teams moved carefully through the wreckage, scanning, confirming, disabling what little remained active. No urgency, no panic, just methodical control, because there was no threat left. They're not reactivating, a technician reported. Energy signatures are collapsing across all units. Another voice followed. Command cores are offline. That one mattered, because without command cores, there was no phalanx, no coordination, no unity, just empty shells. I turned toward Rain. He hadn't moved from the ridge. Still watching, still analyzing. Even now, it's over, I said quietly. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the horizon, tracking, confirming. Only when the last flicker of movement disappeared did he finally speak. No, he said. It's finished. There was a difference. Over meant temporary. Finished meant final. And somehow, that word carried more weight than anything else. A signal came through from Orbital Command. Urgent. Unfiltered. This is High Command. Confirm status of Outpost K-17. No one answered at first, because no one knew how to say it. How do you explain something like this? How do you report the impossible? I stepped forward, activating the channel. This is Commander Elian, I said. My voice felt distant. Even to me, the phalanx assault has been neutralized. Silence. Not static, not interference, just silence. Then, repeat that. I looked out across the battlefield again, at the shattered terrain, at the remains of what had once been their strongest force. And I said it again, slower this time, clearer. The obsidian phalanx has been neutralized. Another pause. Longer, heavier. By what force? The voice asked. I didn't hesitate, because the answer was standing right in front of me. Human infantry. This time, the silence stretched even further, because that answer didn't fit, didn't align with any known data, any known outcome. Clarify, the voice said carefully. I glanced at Rain. He still hadn't turned, still hadn't reacted. Because for him, this wasn't surprising. It was expected. They didn't overpower them, I said. They outmaneuvered them. That was the truth. Simple. Impossible. Undeniable. Data streams began flooding across the network. Battle recordings, sensor logs, environmental readings. Every second of the engagement transmitted upward, analyzed, reviewed, questioned. And across the system, reactions began. Shock, disbelief, denial. Because the Obsidian Phalanx wasn't supposed to fail. It was the final answer, the absolute force, the guarantee of victory. And now, it wasn't. They're requesting full tactical breakdown, a technician said. They think it's an anomaly. I almost smiled, because I understood why. It was easier to believe this was a mistake than to accept what it really was. It wasn't an anomaly, I said. It was a strategy, and strategies could be repeated. That was the part that truly mattered. That was the part that would change everything. Above us, orbital platforms adjusted position, not to defend, but to observe, to study, because what happened here was now the most important event in the system, maybe in the war. They're already reallocating forces, someone reported, pulling back from other fronts. Of course they were, because if the Phalanx could be stopped, then nothing was certain anymore. I looked down at the battlefield one last time, at the scale of it, the destruction, the precision, the impossible outcome, and I realized something. This wasn't just a victory. It was a message, a statement written in stone, fire, and shattered metal. The strongest force in existence had been defeated, not by strength, not by superior technology, but by something far more dangerous: understanding, adaptation, and the willingness to think differently. I turned back toward Rain. You just changed the war, I said. For the first time, he looked at me. There was no pride in his expression, no satisfaction, just calm certainty. No, he replied, we just showed them it can change. That was even more dangerous, because it meant this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Across the stars, across every battlefield, across every commander watching the data feed in disbelief, one truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Humans were no longer underestimated. They were no longer secondary. They were something else now, something unpredictable, something uncontrollable, something no system could fully account for. And after today, every enemy would have to ask themselves the same question. Not how strong humans were, but how they thought, because that was what made them unstoppable. Now comes the part no one prepares for. The reports didn't stop. They multiplied. Every system, every command channel, every strategic network across the sector was now focused on one location, Outpost K-17. What had once been a forgotten defensive point was now the center of attention, not because it survived, but because of how it survived. They're replaying the battle across command, a technician said. Every frame, every movement. Of course they were. They weren't just reviewing a victory. They were studying a disruption, something that shouldn't have happened, but did. And at the center of it all was one name, Rane. They're asking for him. Another voice added, Direct communication. I looked toward the ridge. He hadn't changed. Some stalls, some calm posture, as if none of this mattered, as if the entire outcome had been inevitable. They want to know how you did it, I said, stepping beside him. Rain didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted across the battlefield. Now quiet, now still, now proof. They already have the data, he said. They don't understand it, I replied. That was the difference. Data showed what happened. Understanding explained why. And what happened here couldn't be reduced to numbers alone. A transmission request came through again. Priority override. Sergeant Rain, the voice said over open comms. This is High Command. You are ordered to report your tactical methodology immediately. The tone was formal, controlled, but beneath it, there was something else. Urgency, not authority. Need. For the first time, the ones giving orders were asking questions. Rain finally activated his comm. "Negative," he said simply. The entire command channel froze. Even I turned toward him. "You're refusing high command?" I said quietly. "They don't need a report," Rain replied. "They need to think." The channel came alive instantly. "Clarify that response, Sergeant." Rain's voice remained steady. "They're looking for a formula," he said. "A fixed solution. A pause. There isn't one." Silence followed, because that answer didn't fit their expectations either. "They expect repeatable outcomes," Rain continued. But this wasn't repetition. It was adaptation. Every word landed heavier than the last. "They built a system designed to win every predictable fight. We gave them one that wasn't." I watched the reactions ripple through the comms. Confusion, resistance, slow realization. Because what he was saying was bigger than this battle. It challenged everything they relied on. "Then how do we replicate this success?" the voice asked. That question mattered, because it revealed the real concern. Not what happened here, but whether it could happen again. Rain's answer came without hesitation. "You don't." Another silence. Deeper this time. "You learn to stop fighting the same way twice." That was it. Not a strategy, not a tactic. A mindset. Something no system could automate. Something no doctrine could fully define. Across the outpost, soldiers had gathered. Quietly, watching, listening. Because they knew what was happening. They knew what this moment meant. This wasn't just recognition from command. It was something more immediate, more real. Respect. One of the senior officers approached slowly. A man who, just hours ago, had dismissed Rain entirely. "You should have told us," he said. Not angry, not defensive, just honest. Rain shook his head slightly. "You wouldn't have believed me." The officer didn't argue, because he knew it was true. None of us would have, not without seeing it, not without standing here now, looking at the aftermath. "I was wrong," the officer said quietly. That might have been the most surprising moment of all, because in war, admitting that was rare. "I underestimated you." Rain didn't respond, didn't acknowledge it, because for him, this had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about solving a problem, surviving a battle. Nothing more. Around us, the soldiers began to shift. Subtle at first, then clearer. They stood straighter when he passed. They watched him differently, not with doubt, not with skepticism, but with something else. Trust. Not because of rank, not because of orders, but because they had seen what he could do. "They're already calling this the K-17 method," a technician said quietly. Rain almost smiled, just slightly. "That's the problem," he replied. "They're trying to name it. Because once you name something, you try to contain it, define it, limit it. And this couldn't be limited." I stepped closer. "You don't want recognition," I said. It wasn't a question. Rain looked back at the battlefield one last time, then turned away. "It doesn't change anything," he said. Maybe he was right. Maybe it didn't. The war was still out there. The enemy still existed. And this victory, as massive as it was only one moment. But it had changed something else, something harder to measure. Perception. Because now, no one would look at humans the same way again. No one would dismiss them. No one would assume they understood them. And at the center of that shift, whether he wanted it or not, was Rain, the soldier no one listened to, the one they overlooked, the one they almost ignored, until he did something impossible and made it look inevitable. The wind whispered across the battlefield. Dust hung in the air, sparkling in the dim light of the twin suns. Rubble and shattered metal littered the valley, but it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like proof. Proof that the impossible could be achieved. Rain walked slowly along the ridge, surveying the remnants of what had once been an unstoppable force. Every step was deliberate. Every glance measured. Around him, the human strike teams moved methodically, cleaning the battlefield, ensuring nothing was left to threaten what they had won. But none of them looked at the wreckage with fear. None of them hesitated, because fear had already been conquered. They expected to crush us, I said quietly beside Rain. They never imagined. He didn't need me to finish. They never imagined we'd fight the way we think, he said. And that was the lesson. Strength alone doesn't win wars. Numbers don't guarantee survival. Power doesn't always dictate the outcome. What wins is intelligence, adaptation, the courage to act when others doubt. Above us, orbital satellites recorded the scene. Every commander in the system would see the outcome. Every general, every strategist, every observer would have to rethink what it meant to face humans in battle, not as a force to destroy, but as a force to respect. Rain turned toward the horizon. The smoke of battle curled like ribbons around jagged rock. Do they understand? I asked. He shook his head slowly. Not yet, but they will. And that is enough. We stood there in silence, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over a battlefield that would become legend. The humans who had fought here, the overlooked, the underestimated, had changed something fundamental. It wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that even the smallest, most underestimated individuals could reshape the course of history. Because determination, intelligence, and courage didn't follow the rules of the battlefield. They created new ones. And as the first stars of evening appeared in the sky, there was no doubt the universe would remember this day. The humans would not be underestimated again. And the story of what was accomplished here would echo for generations. Rain didn't raise a banner. He didn't celebrate. He simply walked forward. Because legends don't need recognition. They leave their mark in what they do. And today, humanity had left a mark that no force, no matter how strong, could erase.